Europe, 1944. World War II is at full force, with the Germans holding off troops from the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviets. Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich are still creating their version of a perfect world with the Aryan race, and Germany is holding its prisoners in concentration camps. Here, members of Hitler's SS violate the rights of prisoners of war by experimenting on them without their consent. Meanwhile, Allied forces advance to help the oppressed people.
World War II formed from the ethnocentricity of the German Nazi Party. The almost dead Nazi Party grew at an alarming rate after Hitler's re-entry, almost quadrupling in 4 years. In 1933, Hindenburg appointed Hitler as the German Chancellor. Here Hitler helped make Germany into a police state, taking away rights of citizens. Soon after, in 1934, Hindenburg died and Hitler claimed the position of the presidency of Germany, and claimed himself Führer of the country. Hitler soon adopted the Nazi agenda, and yearned for Lebensraum, or living space. Germany took over Austria through the Anschluss, or political union with Germany and Austria. Then, on September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland with the Blitzkrieg and started World War II.
The Third Reich forced groups of Jews, homosexuals, gypsies, prostitutes, and blacks into concentration camps and death camps. Originally, concentration camps were meant to hold political prisoners, but by the beginning of World War II, they had revolutionized and expanded into holding and exploiting non-political prisoners for labor by the Nazis. These prisoners faced extremely harsh conditions. Many would freeze to death or die of dehydration. Many died of starvation and the experiments conducted on them. The Nazis forced the prisoners to work to death. Eventually, in 1941, the Nazis began to build extermination camps, or also known as death camps, for the prisoners. By the end of the war, 15,000 of these camps were constructed and they held millions of prisoners in total.
One such concentration camp was Auschwitz. Located near Auschwitz, Poland, the Auschwitz concentration camp became the largest of the German death and concentration camps. The first section of Auschwitz, or Auschwitz I, was built in 1940. By liberation, Auschwitz was divided into 3 main camps: Auschwitz I, II, and III, and 45 subcamps. Auschwitz I housed prisoner barracks and Nazi barracks. It also contained the Black Wall, or the Execution Wall, and Block 11, the Severe Torture Building. Auschwitz II, or Birkenau, was constructed in 1942 and ended up being larger than Auschwitz I. Because of its mass size, Birkenau was able to house more prisoners and serve as the main death center of the concentration camp, housing cleverly disguised gas chambers for mass killing. Auschwitz III, or Buchenwald, served as the main housing district for the prisoners working in the rubber factory in nearby Monowitz. Life was hard for the prisoners, and death was prevalent at these camps. Working prisoners of Auschwitz would often look at the Arbeitsmarkt Freigate, wondering if they would ever be free. Some were less fortunate than the average prisoner, and were experimented on at Auschwitz I by Joseph Mengele.
Dr. Joseph Mengele was the head of all human experimentation done in Auschwitz. Mengele had an obsession with experimenting on twins in order to find a way to make German women have multiple births in order to create a superior race that could multiply faster for the Germans. In one instance, Mengele had German soldiers round up 14 twins, which he then put to sleep and injected chloroform into their hearts. This killed them instantly, and he then dissected them right away. In another instance, Mengele gassed 750 women because of a small lice breakout in their block of the camp. He also had interest in researching dwarves, homosexuals, and individuals with deformities. Over a span of 2 years, Joseph Mengele had killed thousands of people. After the war, Mengele fled to South America in 1949. He was wanted by America, Germany, and Israel for his crimes against the human race. Eventually, he was found in 1985, buried in Embu, Brazil.
Inside the walls of Auschwitz I was where these atrocious experiments took place. The purpose of these experiments was to gather results that would give the Germans an edge in the war. Some of the experiments included submerging victims in frigid water for long periods of time in order to find out how long a human can survive when swimming at sea in such conditions. In order to mimic the conditions of wounded soldiers, victims were given fatal wounds, to which dirt, broken glass, and other debris were added. Prisoners were often tortured and killed with various types of poisons like cyanide or phenol gasoline. Some victims were monitored while in altitude chambers, where the air pressure was extremely low, causing severe illness in the prisoners. The aim of these experiments was to collect information on how a German pilot would react to the conditions when flying or ejected from his plane. On one occasion, doctors exposed a mass of prisoners to phosgene gas in an attempt to find an antidote. In another experiment, Nazi scientists wanted to find ways to make seawater drinkable. In this experiment, doctors deprived victims of fresh water and food of any kind. When asked about this experiment, the survivor recalled that he saw subjects licking a freshly mopped floor just to get a little bit of fresh water. Some female subjects were artificially inseminated, while the doctors told them that they were being inseminated with animal sperm. This was a form of psychological torture, as the women believed that they were pregnant with a monster. Among the most notorious of the experiments were those performed on twins. On some occasions, one twin had to undergo a sex change operation, while the other remained its original gender. The twins were then analyzed comparatively. During experiments that involved surgical procedures, the victims were often fully awake and received no painkillers. These are some examples of the ways in which the rights of the prisoners were violated relentlessly in the concentration camps during the experimentation.
The Allies began to travel across Europe, and as they did, they discovered tens of thousands of concentration camps. The Germans soon began to destroy their evidence of mass murder in the camps. They burned down crematoriums and hastily evacuated, leaving the gas chambers behind. Eventually, the Soviets reached Auschwitz in January 1945. Before they arrived, the Germans forced most of the prisoners to walk west, and so the Soviets only found a few thousand prisoners left at Auschwitz. There was an excess of evidence proving mass murder at Auschwitz. In the following months, the Soviets and the Americans liberated many more camps before Germany's surrender. The survivors were in terrible condition after being starved and experimented on. These liberators faced the true horrors the Nazis created. Soon after, on May 7, 1945, General Dwight Eisenhower accepted Germany's surrender, and the war in Europe was over.
The Nuremberg trials finally brought some sense of justice to these inhumane acts of evil. There were 12 trials that took place in several different courts, and over 100 defendants were involved from 1945 to 1949. The famous Nazi doctors' trial decided the lives of 23 different physicians. Their trial had lasted 140 days with 85 witnesses, and over 1,500 documents were submitted into the courts. Of the 23 doctors, 7 of them had been executed for their involvement. Then the Nuremberg Code was created. The code was a pact made after the Nuremberg hearings defining the rights of a test subject in experimentation. The code consists of points that speak of the rights of the experimentee, such as that volunteering is essential, the experiment must avoid any kind of suffering, and the degree of risk should not exceed humanitarian importance.
Multiple countries sent their representatives to discuss rules of war and a set of agreements that protected prisoners of war, the sick, and the wounded during wartime during the Geneva Conventions. In 1929, the Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war was signed, which established conditions POWs must live in and labor limitations. The Nazis broke many of the rules regarding prisoners of war, including not giving POWs a similar quantity of food as they are used to. Because of the poor and inhumane conditions of the concentration camps, after the war, many nations agreed to revise the Geneva Conventions. With the Third Geneva Convention, held in 1949, the countries addressed the problems found in World War II. Article 12 established that prisoners of war were the responsibility of the state, not the people who captured them. In Articles 13 through 16, it stated that countries had to treat POWs humanely, and that their medical and physical needs must be met without adverse discrimination. The Third Geneva Convention displayed the impact the Third Reich had on the rights of prisoners of war.
Nazi human medical experiments were inhumane and brutal. For this reason, they changed the rules of war in the course of history. Recently, the German Medical Association apologized for these sadistic experiments, saying they were contrary to the doctor's mission to heal. The rights of prisoners of war have received greater emphasis due to changes during the Third Geneva Convention, and the responsibility of prisoners has been placed on the state that captured them. The Nuremberg trials led to the Nuremberg Code, which gave rights to experimentees and made the ones in charge of the experiment to be responsible for the patient's health and safety. Unfortunately, these rights were given at the toll of millions of innocent lives.